Hello everybody.
Hello.
I'm Frances Halstead. I'm the Nextdoor Nature Project Officer for Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, and I'm going to talk to you today about urban nature conservation. Another name would be wildlife in our cities and towns, and I'm going to talk to you about the origins of nature conservation in our towns and cities, and really about community work and community engagement, and how really it's not something new. It's been going on for many years, but it's progressed and grown as we've learnt more about how important nature is to people, particularly in urban areas, but also how urban wildlife is different, and it needs special consideration, if you like. So I'm going to talk to you first of all about the pioneers, the history of the people who put nature in towns and cities on the map. And then I'm going to talk about some landmark sites that change people's thinking about nature conservation in cities. And then I'm going to talk about some of the innovating work that's gone on across the world, not just in the UK. And then a little bit about my project and how important community organising is to working with communities and changing nature conservation in cities. And then a little bit about what you can do. Okay? So early pioneers. One of the real champions for urban nature conservation was Professor Herbert Suchop. I hope I pronounced that right. He was a German ecologist, and he worked from 1959, so that shows you how far we go back. And he was at the University of Berlin and the Institute of Ecology, and he established the Berlin School of Urban Ecology. And he was the first ecologist, if you like, who established a modern approach to nature conservation in cities. And a lot of his work initially was in German, so it wasn't very widespread. People didn't get the message about how important it was, but it took a while. But he wrote a book called Urban Ecology, Plants and Plant Communities in the Environments. And what he said was, and what he discovered was, that many of our towns and cities have their own communities that only occur in urban environments. So, for instance, in Bristol Docks, you get a whole load of plants that have been established there along the docks that have come in from abroad, and that mixture of what we call ruderals or wasteland plants from all over the world has established a particular important community, and that's now a site of special scientific interest because of that mixture of wildlife from all over the world, if you like. So he identified certain plants and communities that grow, for instance, on wasteland sites that have been developed and then left to grow, So he was the first one who said, who actually identified the importance of nature conservation in cities. So this is a quote from David Good, who I'll tell you a bit about in a minute. And he says he was one of the first people, at least in Germany, who paid attention to urban habitats and who asked for a nature conservation approach also in urban areas with a different focus than the open landscape. And that's the most important thing, is that it needs a different approach from the management of our nature reserves out in the wider countryside. So because Suchop pioneered nature conservation in our urban towns and cities, Berlin today is one of the most innovative and green cities really in Europe, and it has 430,000 street trees, over 15,000 hectares of woodland, and 59% of Berlin comprises green spaces. Now, how many of our cities can say that? Yeah, there are 80 lakes. The Berlin has utilised spaces that, for instance, from the Berlin Wall, when the Berlin Wall came down, the space between the wall has now been made into an open space for people. So they've looked at innovative ways of making use of spaces in our urban cities. So now this is my hero, and I'm dedicating this talk to him. This is George Barker. He was really the person in the UK who really established urban nature conservation and the importance of nature conservation for people. He wrote in 1978, he commissioned The Endless Village, written by Bunny Teagle, and that was in 1978. And what he found was that there were really rare spiders and insects around the Spaghetti Junction in Birmingham. And nobody thought of that as being important, yeah? So he identified lots of important sites within the conurbation of the West Midlands, and people thought, oh, no, there's nothing of wildlife there. So that really opened people's eyes to think, yes, there is importance here. So in 1984, George Barker was appointed Urban Wildlife Coordinator, and he set up a urban wildlife network, which was, well, it was worldwide, but it was also UK-wide as well. And he organised conferences and to bring the pioneers on urban nature conservation together to swap ideas and to learn from each other. And he also, the other thing he did was he worked for the Nature Conservancy Council, which is now Natural England. And he was an officer in the West Midlands. And of course, the majority of his land was, the area he covered was urban. And so he began to see the importance of community, how community is important to people, and the importance of these urban habitats, and the need for people to have access to wildlife on their doorstep. And he commissioned a brilliant report, which I'll tell you about in a minute, my next one. He commissioned a report called People and Nature in Cities, and that highlighted the importance of open spaces and green spaces to people. And at the time he did it, people are saying, what are you doing that for? That's all about psychology, it's nothing to do with nature conservation. But it was because it brought home the importance of considering people and wildlife together, and how we need to, if we're doing any work in urban areas, we need to contact the local community and get them involved. He also wrote a book called The Nature Reserves in England, 1991. Now, local nature reserves have been around since the 1949 Wildlife and Countryside Act, and local authorities had the power to designate them, but there weren't many designated. So he wrote this book and encouraged people to designate more local nature reserves in our towns and cities and give them proper protection. So, and the other thing he did was he commissioned the West Midlands Nature Conservation Strategy. And this was, again, it was a an innovative project to identify all the important nature sites around the West Midlands and then put them into the local plan to have them properly protected. And while I worked for him, I also produced one for the Greater Bristol Nature Conservation Strategy. So this was a strategy that looked at all the sites in Bristol, well, the wider urban area of Bristol, and protected all those sites and had them put into the local plan so that we would have proper protection. It also identified areas where they were lacking in green space for the communities and where we needed to produce more open spaces for people. So with George Barker, he also set up we had a whole series of urban nature conservation officers, which I was one of, and there was one across the whole county, the whole of the country, and we coordinated work across all the urban areas. Now, another real innovator is David Good. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. Any of you heard of David Good? Yeah. He wrote an article called Urban Nature Conservation in Britain, which is in the Journal of Applied Ecology. And so what was nice was because it was written in the Journal of Applied Ecology, it gave scientific weight, if you like, to the importance of preserving wildlife in our towns and cities, and brought it the importance of wildlife in our cities to a wider audience, if you like. He became the senior ecologist at Greater London Council and then director of the London Ecology Unit and head of the environment at the Greater London Authority. And he wrote a book, a New Naturalist book. I don't know if you've heard of the New Naturalist series of books. Well, he wrote one on wildlife, nature in towns and cities. That was in 2014. And that, again, was another landmark book on the importance of wildlife in cities. So, a bit, the Trust for Urban Ecology, I'm going to talk a bit about this, and creation of new habitats. And the William Curtis Ecological Park was set up on an old lorry park, would you believe? And they converted this old lorry park into an ecological park. And it was right in the centre of London, and it was there for everybody to enjoy. But it was only there for a short period of time. It wasn't there permanently. It had to go back to the owners. But it gave people an idea of what could be achieved in urban areas, what could be created. Yeah? And it was the first urban ecology park set up. So after that, people began to realise that wildlife in our cities was important. It didn't have to be of SSSI status. It didn't have to have lots of rare species. It was important for people. And Gunnersby Triangle was an area of woodland that was between 3 railway lines. Okay, it was between 3 railway lines, and it had been abandoned. It was owned by British Rail, and it was threatened by development in 1981. Local people formed a group and campaigned to protect it. Now, this was at the time that London Wildlife Trust had just been formed. It was there was a big public inquiry about it, and it was the very first time that a planning inspector had ruled in favour of the local community against the developer. So it was a landmark ruling because having made that decision, it then opened the planning. It opened the possibility for other communities to fight for their own sites, and even if they weren't of huge nature conservation value, it recognised the value of sites for people. So this was one of the first and most important planning decisions. And again, David Good stood up and defended the site, and that gave it extra weight, which helped. The site was opened in 1985, and it's now managed by London Wildlife Trust. Yeah, so. So I'm now going to talk a bit about innovation. What can happen in urban towns and cities. As I said, Berlin leads the way. It always has and always will. This is Wilmersdorf Stadium. Okay, it was a stadium that was built to house a huge audience of people, but it never got that number of people attending the stadium. So it had become a bit of an eyesore and a bit of nobody knew what to do with it. The stands were all overgrown with weeds and plants and grass, and they didn't know how to manage it. So the Berlin City Council decided they would graze it. And that's what they do. So now in the centre of Berlin, you have sheep grazing on an old stadium. How amazing is that? Yeah? So another a project I was involved in was in Hermitage Stream in Havant. Now this was, as you can see, it runs all the way up for the urban area, and it's the only major green space in that area. The City Council sent me it was Havant Borough Council sent me a leaflet consultation that they were doing to the local community, which said, we're thinking of greening it up and we might plant a few trees. So I got back to them and I said, what are you doing? What is the point of planting a few trees when no one can access the river? The river is a feature, it's an important feature for people. It was canalised, it was a concrete channel, they were worried, because the concrete channel was steep, they were worried about people falling in, so they fenced it off. So you have this major feature that runs all the way up, but no one had access to it. So we talked to them about removing the barriers, and they're like, oh. And we got a whole load of people involved, the River Restoration Trust, the Environment Agency, lots of different organisations involved. And we rechanneled the bank. It was too expensive to remove the concrete, so we levelled the banks to make them shallow and concrete and covered over with gravel and restored the river back to its natural state. Now this was one of the first ones to be done, and I think since then this type of urban stream restoration has been going on across the country. But it's nice to see what can be done. You need to think outside the box and think just because the site is like that doesn't mean it has to always be like that. We can change. And it has meant that people are rethinking the way we manage our urban streams. You know, they don't have to be in concrete bases. They don't need to, we don't need to be worried about flooding. There are other ways of managing flooding, in our urban areas. So, are there any innovative ways of greening our cities? I know Lucy is working on green bus shelters, which is nice to hear. This is an example of one in Derby. Now this is Bosco Verticali. I don't know if any of you have heard of it in Milan, but it was a tower block that was built as an urban forest, if you like. All the flats are just covered, absolutely covered in plants. And each balcony has its own garden, but it's just amazing. And it's become so popular that it now gets visitors to come and see it, you know, because they're amazed at what it looks like. And wouldn't it be amazing if all our tower blocks could be like this? Yes. And it would bring much more wildlife into our towns and cities. There we go. So this is another place, Singapore, which is really good for urban wildlife. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. Any of you ever been to Singapore? Yeah. It is an amazing city. Again, it's in a beautiful area, but it makes the most of the wildlife it's got. And it understands that by managing its city for wildlife, not only helps the population of Singapore, but it also brings people in. It also brings tourists in to see, so it has a knock-on effect. So this is one of the major hotels in Singapore, and all the balconies are planted up with flowers. Absolutely amazing. I don't know if you can see at the back, but it's all planted up with pink and white flowers. So it just looks absolutely amazing. The other thing they've done is, this is the same hotel, and if you go to the foyer, it's planted with real trees. The whole foyer has got growing, living trees in it. Absolutely amazing. And then around Singapore, they've got green roofs over the cafes. It's just a fantastic place to see, and a really good idea, you know, for things that we could do if we only had the vision. If we had the vision, we could do a lot more. This green wall is in the airport. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do that in Heathrow? Yeah? While people are waiting for their plane, you know, they could sit and you know, admire the wildlife. So it is possible. The other thing they've done is these are water towers that supply the gardens around Singapore, and they've planted them up, so they are completely planted up with plants all the way up the water tower. So absolutely fantastic. Now coming back to Britain, back to England, this is a Swift Tower in Cambridge, built in some water meadows, and the tower itself is quite an attractive art installation, but it also has holes for swifts. And if you go there this time of year, it is absolutely full of swifts going in and out of these holes. So it shows what can be done. Swifts are really threatened, so providing them a habitat to nest in is fantastic. So Nature Discovery Centre, Thatcham. Now, this is what it looks like now. What it used to look like, it was a derelict boating house. And the local authority had to stop boating because it was a gravel pit and it was too deep, and the insurance company wouldn't insure them to have boats on the lake in case somebody fell in. So they said to me, what should we do? We don't know what to do with this building. So I said, why don't you have it as a nature centre? It was on the edge of an SSSI, a really important area of reed beds, probably one of the biggest areas in southern England for reed beds. So absolutely fantastic, and you've got this beautiful lake with birds on. So we approached Bebont, but at the time they weren't interested. So we worked with the local authority and RSPB, and they took it on as a nature site. And eventually, after many years, the other thing I will say is that some of these projects do take years and years. It's not an instant. So what happened then was they got, the local authority managed to get large funding to improve the building and extend it. And it's now owned by Bont and managed as a big nature discovery centre. Fantastic place, which lots of people love to go to. So it's all a question of having that vision and knowing what could be achieved and not giving up, yeah? So a little bit about Nextdoor Nature, which is my project. It's all about working with people in the community. It's all about bringing wildlife to people's doorsteps, but it's very much a case of working with them, giving them the skills to help themselves. Rather than me going in and help doing the work, I give them the advice and encouragement to do it themselves. So it's a project funded by the Heritage Lottery, and it's overseen by the RSWT, the Wildlife Trusts, and the aim of the project is to leave a lasting legacy for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. So I've been working with communities to help improve their areas for wildlife, connecting people with wildlife on their doorstep. And many parts of Cheltenham and Gloucester are quite devoid of wildlife. So we've been trying to work with them to bring wildlife back. So the community organising approach is all about working with different partners. So we've been consulting with the local community to find out what they want, and then working with other organisations to help them. So with housing associations, community associations, churches, multi-faith groups, voluntary organisations, fair shares and colleagues. So all different organisations, bringing them all together to see how we can achieve more. So working with existing projects, this is the Fair Shares allotment in Gloucester, and we ran a fairy garden session for the local children in the half-term holidays, where they made little fairy gardens to take home. But it's more about changing things for the better. This is an area in Cheltenham that the local community contacted me to say, you know, what do we do about this area? There was a huge dead tree here, and it really looked unsightly, but nobody knew who owned it. So we contacted the local council and they did a search, and it turned out that it really didn't belong to anyone, which was nice, because that then enabled us to do something about it. And we got some volunteers and we cleared this area and created a garden. And about 3 weeks later, I was really chuffed to come back and see a little sign in the garden saying, "Thank you." Somebody had stuck a sign up saying, "Thank you for creating this garden for us." So you realise that what you do spreads wider than you realise. So Quilter House, this is an area in Cheltenham that I've been working with. It's a home for people who've been homeless. Many of them are suffering from drug abuse and alcohol problems, and they're helped to recover from these things. Now, I just happened to meet two of the staff on the street and talk to them about wildlife. And they said to me, "Well, we've got this garden, we don't know what to do with it." And when I went there, it had broken down sofas in the garden, it had broken bikes. It was a real mess. They couldn't use the garden. So we worked with the local residents, well, the customers they're called, the customers, to restore the garden. We removed all the rubbish, and they planned what they wanted in the garden. And then I went back once a fortnight with them to improve the garden. And it worked so successfully that now they are gardening it themselves, doing it themselves. And not just the customers, but the staff as well. And then they asked me, well, rather than cutting the lawn, can we create a wildflower meadow? So I went back at the end of last year and we created this wildflower meadow. And this is what it looks like now in the summer. Fantastic. And some of the people I work with have improved so much from doing the gardening and seeing the garden that they've been able to move on to proper housing. So it's a real win-win for the community, but also, for the people who are there and for wildlife itself. One of the staff members said, before you came, all we saw was rats and mice and sparrows. Now we see butterflies, we see lots of different bird species. So they appreciate it, and they can now have meetings in the garden. Yeah, so big benefit. Another area I've been working with is St Paul's. This is an area of deprivation in Cheltenham. Many of the families have mental health issues, they have high unemployment. Many of them are single parent families, lots of different issues here. And I've been working with Cheltenham Borough Homes, and I was lucky in that they'd done a lot of door knocking to find out what people wanted and what would help them. And they said they wanted it to be a nicer area. They wanted it to be better. So we ran some initial sessions creating hanging baskets and growing seeds with the kids. And that was really successful. And we then ran a session over Easter where we got them all to plant plants for Easter. And the children planted up these baskets that we hung around the building. And from just plain railings to a beautiful vista, when we first did it, the local residents said, oh, that won't stay. Someone's bound to vandalise it. Someone's bound to throw them out. But they haven't. They've stayed there and they've been watered. And one of the residents said to me, oh, I love those flowers. They look like little smiling faces. So it's really improved people's attitude and their self-esteem and their appreciation of where they live. Instead of feeling depressed and feeling that they're in a, poor area, they begin to appreciate their area and to like it. Because this was so successful with the children, they all came along, they all planted their baskets, and they loved it so much. We set up a children's gardening session. So we now run a children's gardening club, and they love it. We've had over 15 kids turning up to it, and these are the seeds they planted and growing well, and the kids are lovely. We had a wildlife festival, and one of the kids, we were planting flowers in plant pots, and one of the children who I'd been working with said to the others, I know what to do. I've been to the gardening club. I know how to garden now. I'll show you what to do. So it's given them that encouragement, that self-esteem, really, really positive. So this is an area in Gloucester. This is the community hub that we've been working with. And this is what it looked like before we came along. Really, it was a mess. And this is where people come for, coffee and stuff and to be, have advice from the community centre. But we worked with the local community, and this is what it looks like now. We've been going once a fortnight again, and they've been creating these hanging baskets. Again, they said, these aren't going to stay. What are you doing that for? But they have stayed. yeah, and they're loved. And everybody says how nice it is, and people are beginning to feel pride in their area for the first time. We planted these irises, and there was a strip of, just a very small green strip about a foot between, along an alleyway to the house. We removed the grass and planted flowers. And a couple of weeks ago I was there, and the local residents were picking up the litter themselves. And they're like, well, it's so pretty, I don't want it to get damaged. I love to see the flowers. So it's given them an incentive to keep their area tidy, an area that was really a mess. So it does have huge benefits for people and for wildlife. There's now far more insects and wildlife here than there was before we started. And it's given local people something to do, something positive to do. So they come out once a fortnight and they do the garden, and they've created, there's an area for old allotments, and they're now growing their own food there. So we're also giving people advice on how to improve their green spaces, and working with organised people to remove Himalayan balsam. Now, this is a very recent project we had, and I love the picture, Caroline. But sorry. But Himalayan balsam was a big problem. I remember going to your site last year, yeah, and Himalayan balsam was everywhere. And we talked about how we would get it removed, but you know, it was too late last year. So we organised a week of Himalayan balsam pulling, and it was so nice to get, we worked across several different sites across Gloucester, and it was so nice to get St Bridge working with Barnwood and Armscroft Park, Armscroft Park, all those volunteers working together to across their all sites, and that's had a big impact, because now it's not such a big problem, and hopefully next year it will be much less of a problem, much quicker to do. So what can you do? Well, you can feed the birds and put up bird boxes. There's all sorts of things that can be done, like bug homes, leaving space for nature in your garden. We have my colleague Meg here, who's got People's Nature Reserve, so you can sign up and Wilder Gloss and record what's in your garden. You can create a pond, which is always a huge benefit for wildlife. You can help to protect our biodiversity, yeah? And as I said, everyone can do their bit, even if they've only got a tiny front garden. This was sent to me by Anne Mitchell, and this was her front garden. And she said, I can't grow anything there. The ground is too shallow, yeah? So she dug it up and planted some wildflower seeds. And, you know, they came up absolutely beautiful, and she got comments from all her neighbours saying, oh, that's so lovely, how did you do that? So it shows it can be done. Yeah. So wildlife corridors, they're really important. Our rivers, you know, we need to protect those, our rivers and streams. I've been working with Guardians of the River Chout, who's set up a group to remove rubbish from the River Chout and remove Himalayan balsam. And this was a lovely story, because I gave a talk to the Green Party members about urban nature conservation and what they could do. And one of the people, Jess, came up to me and said, I'm really worried about the River Chout, I want to do something. So I said, well, you know, you can start a group and do stuff. What are you worried about? So we talked about litter, and she got together with Betty, and we worked together about how to go about improving the River Chelt. And they set up a group called the Guardians of the River Chelt, and we've run some litter picks, and they're now hoping to get constituted as a proper group and run on their own to improve the River Chelt. And this is what community organising is all about, is giving them the skills to carry on, to do it on their own. And have bold new ideas that can change the world. This is the London Wetlands Centre in Barnes. I don't know if any of you know it. It was a sewage works, a waterworks, and it's been turned into a wetland centre, and it is absolutely fantastic. Loads and loads of visiting birds in the winter, and it's right in London. Huge asset for everybody in London to see. So there we are, the future is yours, it's up to you. Think bold, think big, don't get, you know, what you can achieve is amazing if you put your mind to it. So thank you very much. Yeah.